for inviting me to speak today. Yeah, I'm an undergraduate senior at Columbia studying computer science, and I've also been, as Quan mentioned, I've been part of his lab for the last 4 years, working primarily on applied machine learning for dementia and COVID-19. And today I'm presenting on one of our papers, machine learning models identify predictive features of patient mortality across dementia types. So first, for some background and motivation, of course, Alzheimer's disease alone, not including other dementias, is classified as the seventh leading cause of death. But not only that, dementia is likely even underreported as a cause of death. So as we can see in like the table to the side, across all age groups, about 5% of deaths list dementia as the underlying cause of death. But the PAF, or the population attributable fraction, can be as high as 13.6%. Which goes to show that dementia might be causing or contributing to more deaths than we even give it credit for. Third, it is difficult both to diagnose and to predict the prognosis of dementia. Well, first of all, dementia can't even be definitively diagnosed without a brain biopsy. And even with clinical procedures and tests to evaluate whether a patient presents symptoms for dementia, it is still very difficult to diagnose like which dementia type it might be, and also to determine the overall outcome and prognosis of for a dementia patient, because dementia themselves can be so diverse. And fourth, for this particular problem of predicting dementia patient survival, machine learning has actually very rarely been applied to to predicting dementia patient survival. And whereas traditional statistical methods like Kaplan-Meier estimator curves, Cox proportional hazards models are usually what are preferred in this kind of problem space. So we thought it'd be a great area for us of research for us to explore, to see how we could apply machine learning to traditional machine learning techniques to this problem of predicting whether a dementia patient will survive or die within different survival thresholds. So in our study, we sourced our data from the National Alzheimer's Coordinating Center, or NACC database, which comprises data from 39 Alzheimer's disease centers, or ADCs. The specific NACC dataset that we used consists of data from June 2005 to September 2021, up to the September 2021 data freeze, which constitutes over 160,000 visit records, over 45,000 unique patients, and over 1,000 variables that include everything from demographic features to neurological examination results to clinical diagnoses and more. And the NACC database is the largest database of its dataset of its type for Alzheimer's and dementia patients, so we thought it would be well suited for this kind of study. For study design, so we started with the raw NACC dataset with the dimensions that we showed in the previous slide. Our very first step was to pre-process the data. So for data cleaning, we first re-encoded any of the features with to be numeric type, and also have to be compatible with our machine learning models. Next, for data imputation, we first removed any features with over 40% missing values, just to make sure that the features that we are including have retained as much information as possible, and we're not just using features that barely have any non-missing values. And then we use multivariate imputation by chained equations, also known as mice, to perform multiple imputation, and then aggregated those imputed data sets to have one complete data set that we can pass into our models. For data splitting, since we tried to predict dementia patient mortality at 4 different survival thresholds, so within 1 year, within 3 years, within 5 years, and within 10 years, so we created separate training and the internal test and external test data sets for all of them. So I can go into the data splitting a little bit more if anyone has any questions later, but the idea is that our training data set will contain this training and internal test data set will contain data up to the June 2019 data freeze, which is actually the original data set we received. And the external data set will contain data from June 2019 up to the September 2021 data freeze. And the purpose of having this external test data set is to just provide another means of validation to determine whether our model is actually able to perform well on prospective data. For model training and validation, we train XGBoost models on. We started with our entire feature set, then we performed feature selection with Shapley additive values, which I'll go into later. We used Bayesian optimization for hyperparameter tuning, and then eventually we ended up with our multifactorial XGBoost models, and then also our dementia subtype models. So next, afterwards, we performed a model analysis. So for each of our models, we plotted the ROC curves. Then we also made these SHAP B-swarm plots to determine which features were the most important. Again, I'll go into this later. And then for a subtype analysis, we also tried to see which features are more important for one dementia versus another, and which features might show some commonalities between dementia types. So again, it's this idea of like starting very general with this pan-dementia data set and then getting very more specific and trying to extract clinically relevant insights about which features are more predictive of survival or mortality among dementia patients of one type versus another. So before we even get into the machine learning, we started by performing our own survival analysis um, in line with what has been done in the literature already, which also helps to motivate our application of machine learning to this specific problem of dementia mortality prediction. So as we can see in these two figures, the first one is a survival analysis based on these different dementia subtypes present in the data. And to the right is the survival analysis based on global CDR scores. In this case, CDR stands for clinical dementia rating, which is a score ranging from 0 to 3. And you can think of it as something that's just used to characterize cognitive and functional performance. So 0, for instance, corresponds to no dementia. And as you can see, the survival probability is highest for the 0 class. Whereas 1 would be mild cognitive impairment, which is this green middle line. And then 3 would be severe cognitive impairment, which you can see the curve dips right away, and the survival probability drops very quickly. And overall, from these, we can see that, well, first of all, in the figure on the left, survival probability and the overall prognosis differs greatly between dementias. For instance, you can see the prion disease, which is the curve on the bottom, this like brownish yellow. The survival probably dips right away just because of the etiology of prion disease and the severity of symptoms upon onset of that dementia type. Whereas other different dementias might differ between in terms of survival probability, which is what helps to motivate our sub-dementia analysis later. And on the right, we see that different global CDR scores. The lower the CDR score, actually the worse the curve of survival probability, which also informs us that that CDR score and overall these features that are correlated with CDR score might give some indication of chance of survival or death. Yeah. So for our actual machine learning implementation, we had a binary classification problem in which we wanted to predict whether a dementia patient would survive or die within each of those 4 aforementioned survival thresholds. So within 1 year, 3 year, 5 year, or 10 year. In this case, we choose to use XGBoost, extreme gradient boosting, for our machine learning models. So for those of you that don't know, XGBoost is a robust tree-based ensemble learning method that uses gradient tree boosting to basically sequentially add new trees that correct the errors that were made in the previous trees. So XGBoost is used very commonly for tabular data in research, industry, even in statistical like data science competitions. So it was our machine learning algorithm of choice for this study. First, we built just 2 feature models, which we selected just age and standard global clinical dementia rating, CDR, which performed quite well as a baseline, but I won't talk too much about them for the rest of the presentation. Afterwards, we built these multifactorial 9 feature models using a subset of 9 features that we selected through a feature selection process. And then afterwards, we built dementia subtype models to see how model performance key predictors differ between those different dementia types. Yeah. But before you get into that, I'd also like to talk a little bit about why we picked XGBoost and this idea of the performance interpretability trade-off. So as we know, we always in the context of clinically relevant problems like dementia patient mortality prediction, we often want interpretability as much as we want good performance. Whereas other tasks in machine learning, for instance, in like topics of like vision or natural language processing, we might be a little bit okay with just having very good performance without understanding what actually happens underneath the hood. But in the case of our models, where we're trying to actually inform clinical practice, determine, what features are important um, for like uh, for diseases like dementia, and understanding how what features contribute to dementia symptoms, and eventually dementia patient mortality. We want to actually understand, how these predictions are being made. So as you can see here, like neural networks are at the top because they're very much a black box and perform very well, even though it's hard to understand what happens underneath the hood. Whereas, simpler models that, might not be as accurate are much more interpretable. So we can actually understand, how these decisions are being made. For instance, decision trees, we can actually see how the splits are being made, which feature is being used to put one patient into one class versus a different class. And in our case, ensemble methods, they're on the top over here, but I would actually argue that they are among one of the more interpretable methods, just because um, we can use feature importance algorithms like Shapley additive values to extract the different kinds of the important features across those different subtrees that it creates. And so, yeah, for feature selection, we used, as I mentioned, Shapley additive explanations, also called SHAP. And of course, the goal of feature selection is to extract, an informative but lean subset of features that retains as much, predictive information about the dependent variable as possible. And in our case, that's, patient mortality or survival. And we always want to strike a balance between, performance and feature set size. Again, going back to that idea of interpretability. So in our case, we chose to use Shapley additive explanations for both, feature selection and feature importance. So SHAP is generally used as a feature importance metric. So, like after you build the models, people use SHAP to just determine, okay, which features contributed most to the prediction. But for us, we also wanted to use it as a feature selection method to actually narrow down our subset of features for our models. I'll talk a little bit about what SHAP is. So SHAP is this model agnostic framework for basically evaluating the relative contributions of each feature to a machine learning model's prediction. So it's actually rooted in game theory from Nobel laureate Lloyd Shapley. And the idea is we want to be able to attribute some value or of the prediction to each of the features. So how much is each feature contributing relatively to this prediction? Specifically, we used TreeShap because we used XGBoost, which is a tree-based method. And basically, the idea of SHAP is to simulate like these different combinations of features, and then compute how well the model performs with or without that feature, which in turn gives us a sense of how valuable that feature is to the overall prediction. Here we conducted feature selection by training 4 default XGBoost classifiers, so no hyperparameter optimization at all, on the training sets with 5-fold cross-validation. And then we used this SHAP algorithm to rank the most important features for each of their survival thresholds. So I just showed the 1-year threshold and 3-year threshold here, and these are the features ranked by SHAP value. And then afterwards, we took the union of the top 5 most important features for each survival threshold. So for instance, the 1-year survival threshold, the top 5 features were NACC age, which is just age, independent. This is the amount of dependency, personal care, the amount of personal care required. Trail B, I believe, is just the number of seconds required to complete the trail exam, which is a cognitive exam. And stove, I think, is just like difficulty operating the stove. So we took the 5 features from 1-year survival, the top 5 from 3-year, top 5 from 5-year, top 5 from 10-year, took the union of those, and in turn we were left with a subset of nine total features that to work with. And we chose to use this kind of aggregate approach so that we would have only just one shared feature set across all 4 survival thresholds, instead of having every survival threshold having its own subset of features, which makes them a much less intuitive to interpret. Okay, after we performed feature selection, we trained new XGBoost models on each of these 4 survival thresholds. We performed Bayesian optimization to tune the hyperparameters. And then we tested our models on both the internal test set, remember from one of the earlier slides, which that test set comes from the the June 2019 and prior data from that 80-20 training test split, and then also the external test set, which was the data after June 2019. So at the top, we plotted the ROC curves for each model, and all of the four models performed quite well, with all of them attaining an area under the ROC curve of over 0.82 in the internal test set. In the table below, we also see that the AUC-PR, or the area under the precision recall curve, is much higher for the longer survival thresholds. For instance, the 10-year model had an AUC-PR of over 0.9. Which we likely attribute to the fact that the lower survival thresholds inherently have more class imbalance because there's a much larger proportion of patients that die within 5 or 10 years as compared to just 1 year or 3 years after diagnosis. And afterwards, to verify our model robustness, we performed a leave one out analysis. So the idea is that, again, we had 39 different data coming from 39 different Alzheimer's disease centers. So what we wanted to do was to see how well the model is performing within each of the data from each of the Alzheimer's disease centers. And this is to also prevent data leakage between sites. So what we did was, for each of these 4 survival thresholds, we first trained data on all the data on all of the training data except for one Alzheimer's disease center, and then we tested on that very specific Alzheimer's disease center. And then overall, we see that most of the models follow along the trend with along the main AUC-ROC curve, which you see in blue. With some models performing somewhat better, some models performing somewhat worse, but most of these models that perform worse are generally have much smaller patient populations, which makes sense. So now that we know that our machine learning models are robust and are able to perform well in this task of predicting dementia patient mortality, the most sensible thing to do next is to figure out which features are actually most important or most predictive of survival or mortality. So here we use the SHAP method that I was talking about earlier, also to calculate feature importance. So earlier we used SHAP on just baseline default XGBoost models to select a subset of features for our feature selection. But now we're using SHAP again, this time on the fully tuned, trained, optimized XGBoost models to determine which features are most important. So here, these are the 9 features that were selected from our feature selection method: personal care, this is dependency, stove number of, or difficulty using the stove, age, performance on the trail exam, sex, I think this is performance on a different trail exam, the number of years of smoking, and then the years of education. And this is a B-swarm plot of the SHAP values for the 1-year survival model. And I'll quickly go over just how to read this. So here, the colors correspond to feature values. So for instance, let me see if I can get a laser pointer. So for instance, this, taking a look at age, for instance, the reddish purple is a high value for age. So of course, that means older age. And then whereas the blue is corresponding to younger age. For sex, for instance, this blue value, I think 0 is male. So low value is male here. And then this red value 1 is high value for sex, which is female. And the SHAP values on the x-axis, this represents the actual impact of the feature on the prediction. So you can kind of think of the positive values as having higher probability of predicting the positive class or the mortality. So higher SHAP value means higher probability of mortality. Negative SHAP value means a higher probability of survival. So now as we try to read this, we can kind of see that, okay, for age, for instance, obviously higher age or older age, right, is contributing more towards higher probability of mortality. Younger age is contributing to higher probability of survival. Sex, for instance, male sex is more predictive of mortality. Female sex is more predictive of survival. And we can see the same things as well. More years of smoking is predictive of mortality. Fewer years of smoking, predictive of survival, and so on. And so we plotted the B-swarm plots for each of the 4 survival thresholds. So Overall, the multi factorial models revealed, I'll just quickly summarize across these four. And the results are fairly consistent across these four survival thresholds. So um, a higher risk of mortality was predicted by one, older age, of course, male sex, higher levels of dependency and personal care required, more years of education, more years of smoking, and poor performance on neuropsychological exams like the trail making test, all of which is, very consistent with what we know about Alzheimer's disease, about dementia as a whole, right? All these things are commonly established risk factors for um, both both dementia diagnosis and poor prognosis. The interesting thing, though, is that at these longer survival thresholds, like 5-year survival and 10-year survival, we can see that some of these the direction of the association was flipped for some of them. For instance, if we take a look here at smoking, right, it seems that actually for 10-year survival, for instance, you see that high values for smoke years is actually seems to be protective against mortality, um, which seems a little bit counterintuitive, but we thought that this might be just due to, for instance, potential protective effects of smoking cessation against dementia risk and mortality that might be, only realized in long-term outcomes. For instance, more chronic smokers might fall more into like this 1 year or 3 year or even 5-year category, whereas 10-year might have more of the benefits of smoking cessation. And also as you can see here, like the trail making test, like trail BRR here, we see that high values are actually associated with survival, whereas low values are associated with mortality. And trail BRR here, I believe, is the number of errors, commission errors made, which again is a little bit counterintuitive, but I think this might also be just indicative of the fact that the data at the longer survival threshold included a slightly different subset of patients. For instance, like a proportion of patients from the early 2010s, just because of the way we stratified our data. So further studies might want to look more at why this kind of like feature inversion happened. So next, we wondered why exactly. So as we see in these 9 features, we don't see any cardiovascular conditions or cancer or any of like what you would consider to be general risk factors for mortality. So we wondered why exactly were like cancer and cardiovascular conditions not present within these top 9 features. So actually, given that, like other leading causes of death were not selected, we wanted to see, were these actually relevant predictors at all? And interestingly enough, after we did another survival analysis with these Kaplan-Meier estimator curves, comparing, non-cancer patient versus primary cancer patients, congestive heart failure patients versus non-congestive heart failure, myocardial infarction patients against non-MI patients, we saw that kind of the same trend was exhibited regardless of whether or not a patient had, one of these other heart conditions or cancer. Right, we see the same association between global CDR score and lower survival probability over time, even though the confidence intervals are much larger for the patient with these other conditions, just because the populations are smaller. But we see that patients, even primary cancer patients with a very high global CDR score, which is like severe cognitive impairment, we still see this same trend of much lower survival probability over time, as compared to patients with a global CDR score of 0, right? Like that curve is barely moving at all, right? So which might give us an indication that actually within this very specific subset of dementia patients, within the NACC data set, the primary cause of their death is actually their dementia, the dementia itself, not these other conditions which may contribute, but not as much so as their dementia conditions. And next, after building those 9 feature machine learning models, we wanted to see if we could apply a little bit more of a granular approach that actually distinguishes between the different dementia subtypes. After all, because the prognosis for one type of dementia could be, vastly different from that of a different type of dementia. So what we did was we stratified the NACC cohort into these 8 most common dementia types, as you can see in the table, which also included non-demented patients as kind of like a baseline for comparison. And we wanted to predict dementia patient mortality within each of these dementia subtypes. In this case, we only used the 5-year survival threshold rather than having 4 different survival thresholds, just so we could avoid having to build like 40 different models. But also because the 5-year threshold, proved to be the most stable from our earlier analysis. Um, yeah, so what we did was we built a separate XGBoost model and with hyperparameter optimization for each of these subsets, each of these subdementia types, and then evaluated the performance in the same way in the internal test set and the external test set. I can quickly summarize the results here. So in terms of performance, all of the models did fairly well in terms of AUC, ROC. All of them achieved an AUC area under the receiver operating curve of 0.79 within the internal test set. Whereas the model is built on like these more commonly defined dementia types like Alzheimer's disease, frontotemporal lobar dementia, Lewy body disease, and vascular dementia. The models generally tended to perform better in the positive class or the mortality class, and therefore they had higher area under the precision recall curve. Whereas models built on the non-dementia patients, and some of the more ambiguous dementia types like this missing unknown class, this other class, and depression, cognitive impairment for other specified reasons. These were more robust in predicting the negative class or survival, which is why they had higher AUC, ROC overall. But overall, all of our models performed quite well across all of the dementia types. And okay, as with the pan dementia analysis with the 9 feature models, we also wanted to see what the most important features were for each dementia subtype model and basically how they compared to one another. And as we suspected, the predictive features of mortality did in fact differ between dementia subtypes. So I won't go too in depth into the SHAP B-swarm plots here, since some of this information will also be part of the next figure. But as we can see, like in the no dementia, as you can see in the no dementia, for the no dementia model, some important features like the number of smoking years. Now we also see general risk factors like hypertension as well, amount of energy. Whereas Alzheimer's disease, we see very much these kind of just standard cognitive risk factors, and that we saw in the 9 feature models as well. For vascular dementia, we see CVCHF, which is congestive heart failure, which makes sense given the nature of vascular dementia, and so on. So next, we performed a clustering analysis to basically group similar dementia types, while also comparing their SHAP feature importance values to one another. In this case, the values that you see in the figure represent the percentage of the prediction that each particular feature contributes. So I think here we have like the top 35 features overall. So laser pointer again. So for instance, for a value of 27 here for vascular dementia, this means that this variable NACC age, so this means that age contributes 27% to the prediction of vascular dementia. And then the other 73% is made up of a combination of these other features. Again, these are all the SHAP values the ranking of the SHAP values used calculated by the SHAP algorithm for feature importance. So as you can see, I already annotated this figure a little bit beforehand, but here are the four clusters we found, and I'll summarize and highlight some of the main findings. So this first cluster that we found is vascular dementia and depression. And in the context of vascular dementia and depression, the mortality prediction was predominantly determined by age, for instance, 27 and 23, which are the highest values across all dementia types. But also, we saw the emergence of importance within things like body measurements and vital signs. as we recall, for vascular dementia, we see 5.2 is the second highest ranked feature after age, with this is CVCHF, which is congestive heart failure, which, given the with a huge value of 5.2, which, given how vascular dementia works and um, uh, how interrelated it is with heart conditions and the cardiovascular system, it makes sense that it has CVCHF has such a high value, just heart failure has such a high value for vascular dementia. Um, but we also see things like body measurements and vital signs, like here for depression, we see diastolic blood pressure, BMI, height, weight. These also become very important values for the mortality prediction. Which again makes sense because of how vascular dementia and depression are very much, dementia types that present very strong, physical deficiencies in addition to cognitive ones. Okay, this second cluster is no dementia and unknown, which again makes sense because, well, first of all, for this unknown class is kind of this kind of arbitrary class of patients who were not classified as having any one of these dementias, but weren't excluded from this no dementia class. So for these individuals without dementia or with unknown dementia status, the prediction was moderately influenced by a combination of different factors like age, biological sex, um, number of years of smoking, geographical location, and also just non-cognitive risk factors, like, as we mentioned before, for no dementia, we have hypertension um, and like amount of energy, which again, makes sense given that, these patients are the ones who are not really presenting any dementia symptoms. So like the general cognitive risk factors like uh, performance on cognitive exams are still important to some degree, but much less so for this no dementia and unknown dementia cluster as compared to, actual confirmed dementia types. In this third cluster, we have Alzheimer's disease and other dementia. So for these patients, the mortality prediction was, almost entirely determined by, age and cognitive features. So things like performance on cognitive screening tests. Though other dementia also had like some higher features for these body measurements and vital signs, similar to the first cluster with vascular dementia and depression. But since other is kind of like this catch-all category, we think that the vast majority of these other dementia patients might be very similar to Alzheimer's disease patients in the first place, which makes up the vast majority of dementia patients anyways. But they just might not have fit cleanly into all of the diagnostic criteria. So yeah, and finally, for our fourth cluster, we have frontotemporal lobar dementia and Lewy body dementia. And so FTLD and LBD are, grouped together because we think that they are associated, with alterations in personality, behavioral changes, and motor symptoms. So we notice that the importance for age drops drastically for this cluster as compared to, the other clusters and dementia types. So for FTLD specifically, a number of new cognitive features emerge, um, like here, commune, which is like community involvement, NACC MOTF, which is decline in motor function, NACC MMSE, which is performance on the total score on the MMSE exam. And similarly for Lewy body dementia, the most important feature was CDR sum, which is the standard CDR sum of boxes. So again, another feature related to clinical dementia rating. But also things like orient, I think, is orientation, and then also the shared kind of MMSE score. But yeah, so to summarize, the first cluster, vascular dementia and depression, characterized by strong physical deficiencies. The second cluster, no dementia and unknown, we see a mix of cognitive features and also general risk factors for death, like hypertension and amount of energy. In this third cluster of Alzheimer's disease and other, dominated by cognitive features, cognitive tests, performance on these cognitive tests, and clinical evaluation. And then in this fourth cluster, we see a mix of alterations in personality, behavioral changes, and motor deficiencies. Okay, and overall, so for future work, we're aiming to incorporate more genetic and multi-omics data. So in our data set, most of our features were primarily, clinical diagnosis features or, performance on neuropsychological tests, demographic features, that kind of stuff. So we were thinking that, incorporating more genetic and multi-omics data might give us a different, or maybe like a more nuanced understanding of, the kind of the biological factors that contribute to dementia patient mortality. We're also considering, maybe replicating these analyses in the future with more state-of-the-art architectures or in deep learning methods. Again, in our case, we erred more on the side of using a very explainable kind of machine learning method, so we could actually inform clinical practice and be able to describe what features are actually contributing to patient mortality. Though deep learning methods might be able to attain much higher performance, stronger performance. And then finally, we might even want to revisit the multi-class dementia diagnosis problem. So again, as I talked about earlier, how difficult it actually is to diagnose dementia. If we could somehow create machine learning models for actually not only diagnosing dementia but also being able to say what dementia type this is, that could have very important ramifications for clinical decision making in the long run. And overall, the whole goal and more motivating factor of this study was to someday have these machine learning models, be able to inform clinical practice, and in the long run improve the personalized care and treatment of dementia. Great, thank you so much for listening. And if there are any questions, I can take them now.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jimmy. And so if anyone have any questions, feel free to either type through chat and I can read it out for you, or you can raise your hand and I can call an order. Okay, so I think I can start with some questions. I remember, Jimmy, ApoE genotype was included in the NAC data set, but was it only in such a small percentage that was excluded, or was just not important feature for survival?
Yeah, I don't know where it might be in here. APOE. Yeah, I'm not sure where exactly it ranks, but it unfortunately wasn't. I don't think it was selected as one of um, the top 5 features for the 9 feature models at least. I don't think it was one of the most important features for the dementia subtype models either. I think my guess would be that maybe APOE genotype is more predictive of dementia diagnosis or dementia onset itself, but maybe not so much for actual prognosis or long-term patient outcomes. But yeah, if there again, I think it would have been great to have a little bit more genetic data in this data set as well, since a lot of these features are correlated with one another in some way or another. So having more genetic data might give us a broader understanding of the problem.
Right. And I wonder, what's your current thought on, you talk about more advanced architecture. What's your current thought about the possible future architectures and how to implement?
Right. Yeah. So again, um, I think all the new architectures there are, they're very cool in their own ways, and I think they've done very well in the kind of problem spaces they were tailored for. So like transformers specifically were um, made primarily for with like natural language processing and vision problems in mind, just because of how incredibly large those feature spaces are and how difficult it is to interpret those features in the first place. For instance, like each feature would be like a single picture or a pixel or like a single word token. So I think those problems are more tailored for like I think like transformers and deep learned convolutional neural networks, these more advanced architectures are more tailored for those kinds of problems where you have these like very, very large feature spaces and you don't really you care more about just the overall performance or the prediction or like the words that are generated afterwards or the image that's generated afterwards rather than what the processes that are happening underneath. But I think in the case of tabular data where we have very specific features that we're able to interpret like age, sex, performance on a cognitive test. I think in these cases we I think XGBoost and these kind of traditional machine learning methods are still preferred, both because they are more explainable and also because um, you know more advanced deep learning architectures aren't contributing as much to improving the prediction, and so that trade-off isn't really as worth it as for more complex problems.
Right. Thanks. Simran asked a question. How do you think this model can be used in a clinical setting?
Yeah, so I think our initial thoughts were to just, as with, I think in cases of research, it's just for the first part, it's just to be able to inform clinical practice in general. I don't think these models will, actually get implemented in clinical setting, at least not for a while. So what we tried to do was to actually like extract as many insights as possible about, these different dementia types and, what's actually contributing um, to dementia patient mortality. So for instance, like by by outlining like the key features that are contributing to mortality for vascular dementia versus for Alzheimer's disease, that in turn might help doctors provide more personalized treatment plans to determine like, okay, for a particular patient, like how many years of smoking do they have they been smoking for like a long amount of time? Are they performing well on these specific cognitive exams? And in turn, that might give them some indication of uh, how whether a patient is well, like how long a patient is expected to live after a diagnosis. So I think the main priority right now is for um, to give some insights for clinicians to keep in mind in their practice.
Exactly. When I present to the neurologists here at Sinai, they did say that, it will be insightful if the model performed well, and the features may be a neurocognitive test that they didn't think it would be associated with the patient's near-term survival, but if that flagged it out, it could be helpful for them.
Right. Exactly. Yep.
Exactly what you said. Ali has a question. Ali, I asked you to unmute if you want to ask.
Yeah, thank you for the presentation. It was really illustrative. I have one question about the Shapley feature importances.
Yep.
So, yeah, so for a feature, uh, this method tells us uh, the importances with respect to numerical values of those features, right? But we don't
Yes.
have do we also have a way of measuring importance among the features, among the 9 selected ones?
Yeah, so right now these features are like actually I'll go back to this slide. So yeah, so like these 9 features, these are already ranked in terms of like overall SHAP value. So personal care is like the most important feature for 1 year
Mhm.
survival, and then education is the least important.
Okay, maybe I can ask more specifically.
Yeah.
When we were determining those 9 features, uh, we were not determining them based on the predictors' predictions, right? They were not based on the model's predictions.
For feature selection you're talking about, or for feature importance?
Yes, for feature selection.
Right. So what we did for feature selection, of course, we kept the held out test set, so we didn't use the test set for feature selection. So
Mhm.
we just did fivefold cross validation within the training set. We trained, default XGBoost models, so no hyperparameter tuning, and then
Mhm.
we used the predictions within like the held out fold in the cross validation to calculate the SHAP values.
Hmm.
Yeah. Does that
Okay.
make sense or?
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense, but I still don't quite understand whether we can determine which of those features are more represented in the model's predictions.
Mhm. Um, yeah, are you asking about just like how, I guess how like SHAP is even calculating which features are more important, or is it
Yeah, I guess, yeah, if I could see it, it would be more illustrative for me.
okay, well this is a variant of like the formula that SHAP uses for
Mhm.
calculating it. Like the idea is that we basically we test like we create like all these different combinations of features,
Mhm.
and then the score that we attribute to a particular feature for a model's prediction is basically like after simulating all these different combinations, we see when that feature is included, how much better does the model do? When that feature is excluded, how much worse does the model do? And then it does some like sort of aggregation over all these different combinations to give an overall score to that feature, to say like, okay, this feature contributes this relative amount, and then that's how we rank the features at the end.
Ah, okay.
Great. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Great. Thank you. And Kaden has a question through chat. Can you explain a little more about the XGBoost models?
Yeah, sure. I can go back to one of the slides. So yeah, again, so XGBoost is a gradient boosting method. So well, first of all, like XGBoost is the base model for an XGBoost model is like these decision trees. I don't know if I can circle it, like decision trees, where the idea is that, basically we start at like a root node and then we split on particular features. So for instance, let's say if age is greater than 65, we go into the right subtree. If age is less than 65, we go into the left subtree. And then we keep doing these splits until we reach one of the leaf nodes at the bottom. And then one of the leaf nodes will output, one of the two classes. So maybe like this class is like mortality, and then this other class is survival. And the idea of XGBoost is, so the problem with a decision tree is that it's not always the most stable when and generally doesn't perform that well when you have just like a single decision tree. So what XGBoost does is it creates one decision tree, then it computes like the error or the residuals within that decision tree, and then it basically tunes its weights, and then creates a second decision tree to basically like correct the errors that were made in those previous trees. And it keeps repeating this process. And then in the end, we see like, sorry, in this formula here, like the overall prediction is going to be like a combination of the predictions made across all the trees, and then with weights assigned to each of the trees. And this is a very common practice, like in ensemble methods, like in random forest as well. We also taking decision trees, and you're basically taking like a single model and then creating multiple of them, and then combining results across those models, which in turns is usually a more stable way of generating predictions as compared to having just like a single model.
Cool. And Salah has a question. Salah has mute.
So on the more technical side, like for predicting for patient mortality, are you using like a single target column, such as like patient dive column, or is it like a combination of different columns?
Yeah. So you're saying like the variable we're predicting, right? The mortality.
Yeah. Mhm.
Yeah, I believe. Yeah, I don't know if I have it here, but I believe it's just a single column. It's just like NACC like died or death or something, which is just like whether the patient has died. The more difficult task was actually, generating how do we actually split this data, right? How do we verify whether a patient has died? So what we had to do was basically group by like patient ID, right? Because it's a longitudinal data set. So like these patients will be followed up over time, and eventually like once the patient initially visits, well, presumably they'd be alive. And then in the future, once that patient comes back to like one of the clinics, and then we get an updated value of whether that patient has died. So basically for a particular visit ID, we group it into either like mortality or survival based on these criteria, whether like the visit was within this time frame, and then whether that death whether their death comes within that survival threshold of 1 year, 3 year, 5 year, or 10 year.
Okay. I think that was a great presentation. Thank you, Jimmy, and thanks everyone for a nice wide range of questions. And so if you look for other seminars, you can always check out openboxscience.org. Thank you all for attending, and thank you. Bye.